Here with you. I am not Marty Douglas, but I do play him on TV today. And we welcome our kids ministry into church with us today. So if there's some kids around you that get a little rambunctious, just offer them a Tic Tac or a piece of gum, or go get them a donut if we have any left. But on the other hand, we may need to hear what they have to say. So God can speak as He has in the past through the cries of a child. How awesome is that? Well, as you heard, what a great rendition of Psalm 13. You can just feel the hurt that David was writing about, and maybe you can identify with David today, being beat down, worn down, and nowhere to go but up. And that's the hope that we have, is nowhere to go but up. So maybe today, if your heart feels hollow, if your body aches with weight that prevents you from sleeping, that sleep won't fix, that nothing else, it's like a spring that's been so tightened that at any moment, another trauma, another blow is just going to cause that spring to expand and explode. Maybe you're here and you've lived with the exhausting pressure of always looking over your shoulder, emotionally, spiritually, physically, being outnumbered, outgunned, and on the road and on the run. You're in good company because you sit where David sat in his life. At this time, David was a leader in Saul's army, but because of his success, he became enemy number one. He had a target on his back. Saul had mustered the whole army of Israel to go after one man because he had a hatred, a sickness, a spiritual sickness that caused him to be jealous of who David was. So we're going to look at this lament of David when he was on the run. And from the moment that Saul's anger and his jealousy turned and targeted David, David's life turned upside down. It was never the same as long as Saul was pursuing him. Here he was the anointed future king, but day in and day out, he was on the run. He didn't feel like a future king. He felt like an outcast, a fugitive. Enemies oppressing him. Men who were former friends and colleagues who he had shed blood in battle with were now after him. He found himself sleeping in dark caves, breathing the damp air of dread, and constantly listening for approaching footprints. His nerves were raw, his body was tight with tension, and his sense of safety was gone because he was on the run. You can read about the background for kings of what David was facing in 1 Samuel chapters 19 through 24, but here's just a short overview. Again, Saul is attempting to kill David, sending him on the run, hiding in caves. Out in the Judean wilderness, the caves of En Gedi, there were places that David sought refuge in. In chapter 21 of 1 Samuel, David is on the run. He's looking for any place of safety. And in that scene, we see David going over to the Philistine king, into the land of the Philistines, and seeking protection. And he was acting like a crazy man, drool coming out of his mouth. He was just screaming at the wind, so to speak, just trying to find any place of refuge. In chapter 23, he's constantly on the move, looking for ways of protection, constant threats. You know, Saul is on his heels. He never got any peace during this time of his life. And all of this trauma just continued, trauma upon trauma upon trauma. And so as you think about his life, begin to think about where you're at in that story. Maybe you're not hunted on a daily basis, but maybe you're haunted by your past. Maybe you're haunted by the trauma that you faced in the past, and you just can't get out from under the strain of that. So let's journey toward our healing as we look at David's lament here in Psalm 13. Listen as I read. He begins in verse 1. He says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and every day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. My enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, for he has been good to me." You see, that's David's trauma story right there. Crying out, how long? You see, a trauma that we face in life, it doesn't just leave a scar. It reshapes our entire system. Trauma rewires our brain to always be in protection mode. And when we go into protection mode, that survival mode that we get into when we're facing a fight, that's where we live day in and day out. And that's exactly where David found himself. And he was crying out, Lord, how long am I going to have to live like this? How long am I going to have to live in a cave? How long am I going to have to cover up my footprints so nobody can follow me? How long? You see, as a counselor, I look at this in a way that others may not. My daughter and I did a study on this, and we put some thoughts down in the devotional book. But we looked at all of the diagnosis that maybe David carried from our modern day perspective. He lived in a time of chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is something that happens when stressful or harmful experiences keep happening over a long period of time. And maybe that's been your experience. You grew up in a dysfunctional home or faced dysfunction throughout your life, and the trauma just kept happening. And David faced that. Not only was he on the run from Saul at different times in his life, his own son took the throne from him, and David had to flee Jerusalem. Samuel dies. He has sin in his life, and a child dies, and just trauma after trauma after trauma. And it's just chronic. He can't get away from it. Imagine where he was. He wasn't safe. And maybe you can think back on your own life, growing up in an unsafe place, living through years of emotional, physical, and spiritual abuse, or facing repeated loss or crisis. Instead of one big event, chronic trauma is just ongoing. You never get any relief. And what that led to is David living in a way of hypervigilance and fear. That's just bone-weary tired. Hypervigilance and fear is when your body stays stuck in that survival mode. And David was there. He was living it. His body was always in survival mode. And maybe you can think back to times in your life where you were living just to survive. You couldn't even think about thriving. You couldn't think about anything else. You were just stuck in trauma. Veterans face this. I've talked with veterans who just live in a state of hypervigilance. You want to have fun with a veteran? Take him to a restaurant and try to sit where you're facing the door and his back is to the door. It's like a fun dance because he's going to sit eventually where he's looking at the door because he wants to know who's coming in, because he's hypervigilant. He's always in that survival mode. And sometimes that leads into fear because then we get, who's after me? Where are they coming from? What direction? And you just can't get away from it. And he says, how long will my enemies triumph over me? He was in that mode. One thing, and he was ready to throw down and fight because he was going to survive. Leading to feelings of abandonment and isolation. He lived in a place of feeling abandoned. He went from being the head general of the army, the supreme commander, so to speak. And then as people began to cry out, Saul has killed thousands and David has killed tens of thousands. And the king was like, whoa, can't have that. Can't have this little squirt from Bethlehem usurping my prominence. And on one occasion, Saul threw a spear at him, trying to kill him. And then the whole army goes after him. He's abandoned, isolated, forgotten, feeling hidden from God. And we read that in Psalm 13. And we face that as well. I've counseled with people who feel like they have been abandoned, rejected. They wear that identity of rejection throughout their whole life because of trauma. And so David, as he faced this, he was beat down. And that's what we see in these first two verses. He says, how long? How long, God? He's beat down. And that's what he says. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? And I think we've all asked that question. How long, God? When's this going to end? Please, God, give me some relief. Let me have a day of peace, a night where the voices in my head aren't just screaming at me. How long, God? How long? Will you forget me forever? The storm of trauma is going on without end in sight, and we began to get beat down. And David says, how long will you forget me? That word in the Hebrew for forget, it's a word that carries the idea that something or someone is intentionally being disregarded, intentionally being set aside. And that's what David's asking. God, will you intentionally set me aside forever? Will you sideline me in a way that you don't even regard me anymore? Lord, how long? Will you do this forever? Is this my lot in life? Will I continue to face life forgotten, disregarded? And that's where he was. He intentionally felt God was disregarding him in his circumstances. Now we have to be careful with our feelings here. Because that's how David felt. He felt intentionally forgotten by God, but the reality is David was an anointed king of Israel. He was the king in waiting, but yet he felt abandoned by God. And we have to be careful with our feelings, because our feelings do not determine our outcome. Our feelings do not determine the outcome or our destiny. You see, he was destined to be a king. And once he was king, God made a promise with David, said, you will have an heir on your throne forever. And then coming from the line of the tribe of Judah came Jesus, our Messiah, to fulfill that promise to David. But David, in this point in life, he was feeling forgotten, abandoned. We can't let our feelings run our life. Because if we do, we're never going to have any peace. Because you might get up one day feeling great. You might get up another day feeling horrible. And our feelings do not determine our outcome or our destiny. Because God determines our outcome. God determines our destiny. David was in a cave, but he was destined for the throne. You may be feeling like today you're in a cave, but God has a destiny for you that will be greater than you could ask or imagine. And the trauma that you've been facing will just be part of your story. It will not be part of your identity. It will just be part of your story. In our lives, trauma seems to come and stay. And when that happens, we do believe that God has forgotten us. Culture and society had given David a false identity. He was branded a fugitive, a traitor. And everybody was looking at David. Anytime they saw him, there he goes. Saul's going to kill him one day. He's going to catch up to him. And maybe that's how you feel, that you've been branded something that's not your true identity. Do not accept the wrong identity. Because David had taken on for a while that victim identity of a fugitive and a traitor. Ask God what your true identity is. Ask the Holy Spirit, who do you say that I am? And then whatever God tells you, that's your destiny. That's your outcome. And he goes on to say that he wrestled with his thoughts. How many of us wrestle with our mind? We hear voices in our head and it's horrible things telling us to do things or telling us, you're no good, you're nothing, you'll never amount to anything. And that voice just continues to play, and that's where David was. He says, how long must I wrestle with my thoughts and every day have sorrow in my heart? He was beat down by life. Verses 3 and 4, we see that he was worn down. You ever see something that's just been completely worn out? It's no longer useful for its intended purpose. And David, at this point, maybe in his own life, he no longer felt useful for his intended purpose. And he's crying out. It's almost like he's saying, God, if you don't intervene, I'm a dead man. Ever feel like that? God, if you don't do something, my ship sunk. The train left the station, and I'm not on it. God, if you don't do something right now, I don't know that I have a tomorrow. You know, as a pastor's family, we're not exempt from trouble. There was a time in the life of my family where I called a counselor and I said, hey, we need to come in for counseling. And that's kind of where God led me down this road. And she said, well, I can get you in a week or maybe 2 weeks. And I said, oh, no, you don't understand. I don't have 2 weeks. I'm not even sure I have a family tomorrow. I said, I need help. I was crying out, God, how long? If you don't do something, God, I'm a dead man. I've got nothing. That's where David was living. He was so worn out. He says to God in verse 3, he says, look on me and answer, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes. Change my countenance, God, or I will sleep in death. He says, how long? And then he says, Lord, look on me. David is asking God, this word is a great word. He's saying, God, scan my situation and intervene. Don't just glance. He says, God, look at me. Look at me, God. and see me. How many of our kids do that to us? Mom, Dad, look, look. They don't want just a passing glance. They want our attention. And David was so much more with God. He says, God, look on me. Scan the situation and intervene. And then he says, answer. And this word look and answer come together, asking for the favor of God. And it's a word, this answer is a word asking God to, again, size up the situation, God, and then I need you to testify on my behalf. I need you to shout on my behalf. I need you to sing aloud on my behalf. That's what David's asking God to do. And you can do the same thing. God, look at my situation. I need you to sing. I need you to testify. I need you to shout that I have hope. Because you're a covenant God. And he's crying out to using that covenant name of God, Yahweh, Jehovah. You're in covenant with me, God, and I need you to look at my situation, and I need you to cry out the truth about my situation. Give light to my eyes. Change my countenance. Change my situation. You know, you run into people that you see the light has gone out in their eyes. There's no hope. There's no life. That's where David was. People looked at him and just saw a hollow man. And he's like, oh God, give light to my eyes, or I'm going to lay down and I'm not going to get up. You ever been there? I'm just going to lay down and I'm just going to pull the covers up over me and the world is no longer going to exist. But David says, God, size up the situation. Look at me. Answer by crying out, testifying, and giving light to my eyes. And as he began to understand that God would do that because God is in covenant with us, he began to take a different direction. He began to look up. Because when we've hit bottom, there's nowhere to go but up. Where should I go but to the Lord? And David begins as he says, but I will trust. He had nowhere to go. He couldn't depend on his army. He had a ragtag force of about 400 guys, probably worse off than him. And they said, David, we're so bad off, you get to lead us. And he's like, what did I do? Imagine having 400 men around you just going, you're it. And he's like, I'm not it. How long, O God? And he says, but I will trust. And this word, when you're looking at the Hebrew letters of this word trust, the ancient script kind of gives some insight into this. The word picture of the letters, it looks like, one letter looks like a secured walled place, surrounded by a structure or a fence that you can put confidence in. And so David is saying, but I will trust in your unfailing love. He says, your love is something I can trust in. It is a protective structure we sang about that we can run to and be safe. And David says, I'm going to trust because in this, I'm in a walled structure with a fence that I can rely on. There's confidence here. And this word continues to give us some insight with that surrounding wall or refuge, a place of security and safety, an unshakable structure protected from external threats. It carries the idea of two pieces of metal being welded together. Any welders in the room? A few of you? When you begin to join two pieces of metal together, basically you are melting them together with an unbreakable bond. And that's the idea of this word trust. He says, God, I need to trust you so that we are so intermingled that I don't know where I end and you begin. That I'm going to cling to you, God. I'm going to be so joined with you that I'm going to trust. And then it gives the idea of surrender, of just throwing yourself down before a holy God and say, I give up. I'm no longer going to run. I'm no longer going to be beat down. I'm going to trust in you because I'm just going to surrender. And what are we surrendering to? We're surrendering ourselves into God's unfailing love. That word is hesed. It's very similar to the Greek word agape that we're familiar with from the New Testament. But it's an enduring love and loyalty. It's mercy and grace. It's unwavering faithfulness to his promise. It's a steadfast love that binds him to his people. He says, I'm going to trust in your unfailing love. And my heart is going to rejoice in your salvation. That word salvation in the Hebrew is Yeshua. It comes to us in the English transliteration as Jesus. It's the Old Testament word that the name of Joshua, which means the Lord saves or the Lord will save. It's a name that emphasizes God's role as the Savior and has a deep connection to the divine name and covenant name Yahweh. And so David is crying out, he says, I'm going to trust in your unfailing love, and my heart, no longer is it going to be in turmoil, it's going to rejoice in your salvation. Even in the midst of his ongoing trauma and his inner struggle, David knew what direction to go. He went up. He went back to his roots. He went to God, to the covenant, the one who is worthy of our praise, that we can sing to the Lord, for he is good, and praise becomes a weapon. So maybe you're here today, and all of this trauma kind of resonates with you, and you just go, I just need something. For some of you, the first thing you need to do is cry out to Jesus for salvation. To cry out to the Lord who saves and begin this journey of faith. Turning away from the trauma and turning and putting your focus on the Lord. So let's do that.